Massimo Pigliucci is a philosopher at City University in New York, and as a public intellectual, he maintains a popular blog, Rationally Speaking. Truth is a concept that permeates all our lives, but is it a monolithic concept? Often not. How should we think about truth and the different theories of truth?
I think we need to be clear, first of all, that truth actually is has different meanings depending on what area of human knowledge or human endeavor we apply it to. For instance, a scientific truth, I think, as a concept, is something very different from, let's say, a mathematical truth or a logical truth. Scientific truths are by nature usually provisional. They are arrived at inductively, using empirical evidence, that sort of things. On the other hand, a mathematical truth or a logical truth is usually arrived at deductively. It's once arrived at, that's it, you're done. Once that you know that the Pythagorean theorem is true, there is no way it's ever going to be false. It's not provisional in that sense. So those are at least in those areas those are very different concepts of truth. And then, of course, if we get to things like aesthetic truths or moral truths, then clearly we're talking about something, again, yet another beast. I don't think there is such a thing as aesthetic truth. There are aesthetic judgments which do make sense within certain cultural contexts, but I don't think that rise to the level of truth. There may be such a thing as moral truth, but not in the sense, in anything like the sort of the scientific sense or even the mathematical sense. I mean, I think that moral truths are better thought of as conclusions that one arrives at based on reasoning about our values, where they come from, what is it that we value or not value, and for what reasons. So we can have agreement on what we call moral truths, but certainly it's got nothing like a scientific truth or a logical truth. So we need to separate different meanings of the word truth, because otherwise a lot of confusion ensues. If you're thinking of scientific truth and you're talking about morality, then you're talking apples and oranges.
Sure, clearly it's not a monolithic concept. Just to clarify some of those points there and just get to expand in some different areas. Of course, most would agree that morality is a subjective analysis of a situation, usually arrived at by conclusions, as you said, by argumentation and rationality. Obviously, morals are pluralistic historically, and we can see that across the world today. Logical truths, quite clearly, 2 and 2 is not 5. A dead man is not alive. Scientific truth, though, is a very interesting area. Most practice aspects of philosophy of science know that it's inductive, provisional. We can't, by definition, always know an absolute truth in scientific inquiry, mainly because it's built on theoretical propositions that are based on empirical data. But of course, this can all change. But importantly, with this in science, and this is an area that you've got expertise in particularly, and I know it's your future work and your book. How does this fundamentally tie in with progress and truth? Can we ever make progress towards a truth in science? This is very problematic, isn't it?
It is problematic. I mean, it's certainly more problematic than most practicing scientists probably would think. But then again, that's they're not epistemologists, so it's not really their job to worry too much about that. I think it is the concept of scientific truth is in fact a little bit problematic, not in any way that would give comfort to, let's say, an extreme postmodernist or a creationist or whatever it is. I do think that science demonstrably does make progress. It's the problem is that it's much more difficult than one may think at first to give an account for how actually that progress occurs. So first of all, let me back up for a second here about something that I said a minute ago, which is I said that scientific truths are arrived at inductively and that they're typically provisional. But I should be more careful there. That's true for scientific theories. And to some extent is true for some notions in science that we think of it as factual. But there are certain notions in science that are pretty much established, and I don't think we're going to go back on it. For instance, the fact that the sun is a star, at this point, that's as solid a fact as you can possibly imagine. I mean, yes, you can take the sort of the radical skeptic perspective and say, well, there's no way to have any sure knowledge of anything. Fine. That is true. We can bracket that and ignore it for a moment, and for all, in fact, for more than a moment, for all practical reasons. We can ignore that, but saved for radical skepticism, there are certain notions about science and certain facts that science has arrived at that are pretty much as well established as anything you can think of, but those are not the interesting ones. The interesting ones are the notions that science is currently working on, the stuff that is at the frontier, especially scientific theorizing. Those clearly are in fact provisional. I mean, Newtonian theory turned out to be wrong, replaced by general relativity. Well, now we know that general relativity is either wrong or incomplete, but it is less wrong than Newtonian mechanics, which of course brings us to your question, which is, well, less wrong in what sense? And there are several different accounts for how science makes progress. And you mentioned the book that I'm working on. That's a book on how philosophy actually makes progress that I'm writing for University of Chicago Press. But as part of that project, in the book, I explore the concept of progress in other fields, and particularly in science and in mathematics, because I think that those are good models for thinking about progress in philosophy, and yet they're distinct enough. I don't make in the book. I'm not making the argument that philosophy makes progress in the same sense in which science, or in fact even math, make progress. But I think that one needs some kind of idea of how other fields make progress in order to say, well, does philosophy itself make progress, and so how? So doing my research, I'm a philosopher of science, and doing my research for the book on progress in science, it turns out that there's a number of accounts. You can use what is called the functionalist account. These are people like Thomas Kuhn, for instance, or more recently Larry Loden, who essentially say they are anti-realists about scientific theories, meaning that they claim that there is no way to know whether scientific theories refer to a world in a sort of in a true sense. What all we can know is that they work, that they're empirically adequate. In other words, they're not. These are not people who deny that there is a world out there. They just say that there's no way for us to know whether our theories actually describe that world as it truly is or not. Now, they have a point. I'm not an anti-realist myself. I'm not a functionalist in that sense myself. But they have a point. And in fact, the point is well illustrated by the transition that I mentioned a minute ago between Newtonian mechanics and general relativity. So, as it turns out, Newtonian mechanics is in fact wrong. I mean, it gives us the wrong description of space and time. For Newton, space and time were fixed. The universe is a sort of a model of a billiard ball table. There are things happening, but the space itself is fixed. Einstein, on the other hand, tells us that space-time, first of all, that time is a different aspect of the same basic thing of which space is part, so they're not distinct. And also space-time is, in fact, flexible, changeable. So those are very different views of things, right? And from Einstein's perspective, Newton was, in fact, wrong about the basic nature of the physical world. And yet, if you want to shoot a cannonball or send a probe to Mars, you better use Newtonian mechanics, because relativistic calculations are too complicated. You just can't do them well enough and quickly enough. And Newtonian mechanics is, functionally works very well. You will get the cannonball where you want it to land, and you will get the probe to Mars. So the question, of course, so functionalists seem to have a point there, right? They're saying, look, we do know of situations where a theory, according to scientists themselves, turned out to be wrong, but in fact it is empirically adequate for a certain period of time. So, how do you know that the current theory that scientists tell you is correct isn't going to turn out to be exactly the same situation? In fact, it turns out it's going to be wrong, but it's functionally or empirically adequate. So that's one way of looking at it. I don't particularly buy into it. I think it's an interesting way to look at it, and it raises interesting questions about truth about progress in science. I do think that a better way of looking at it is that science does make progress in the sense that it arrives closer and closer to the truth. So this is an account that is sometimes cashed out in terms of verisimilitude or truth-likeness. Right? So these are people who suggest that Popper was one of the first ones to articulate this view of science, is that it's not that Newton was wrong and then Einstein is going to also turn out to be wrong and so on and so forth. It's that Newton was wrong, yes, but Einstein is going to turn out to be wrong, but less wrong than Newton. Now, the question is, of course, how do you, so in other words, Einstein's theory is closer to the truth. Now, the question is, how do you cash that one out? Because in order to say that a theory is closer to the truth, it seems like you would have to know already what the truth is. How do you measure the distance from an object that you don't know what it is, right? And that's an interesting objection. I don't think, and many philosophers of science don't think it's a fatal objection at all. There is all sorts of stuff that we don't see and yet we can measure. So, for instance, before turning to philosophy of science, I was an evolutionary biologist, and part of my empirical work was to measure natural selection, and in particular, in order to measure natural selection both in the lab and in the field, you have to have estimates of fitness, because by definition, natural selection is whatever change in a population increases the fitness of that population to a particular environment. Well, you can't measure fitness directly. There's no way. Fitness is a hypothetical construct, and it's what social scientists call a latent variable. There is no direct access to it. What you can do, however, is you can measure things that you think are correlated with fitness. So these are proxies, basically. And again, that's both what ecologists and evolutionary biologists and, in fact, social scientists do all the time. And you measure these proxies, and then you can estimate the value or the position of the hidden variable, the latent variable. I think some philosophers of science have defended a similar account of truth-likeness. That is, you don't need to know exactly where the truth is. What you need to do is to have available a certain number of instruments that indirectly estimate the distance between your current hypothesis and the truth. And scientists, I think, would agree. I think that a physicist would tell you, well, we do have those instruments, and one of those instruments is the idea that Einstein's relativity explains everything that Newtonian mechanics explained, and then some. And so we think we're getting closer to the truth, whatever that is, simply because the new theory is actually inclusive of the old one. It's not that we have discarded this stuff because it wasn't working. Is you can actually derive Newtonian mechanics as an approximation from general relativity.
Sure. Well, good to see that you came to your senses. Used to be a scientist and now you're a philosopher. That's good to see.
That was my midlife crisis, yes.
That's good to see. But some of the points you touched upon there, if we've got time, I might go back to some of the differences into the social and natural sciences. But at this moment in time, it's what you were saying there in terms of, okay, can we get at this absolute truth and progress through science, or are we just kind of chipping away better aspects of reality and not necessarily discarding the old theories, but kind of bring them in inclusively to another area? So, okay, aspects of Newtonian physics are no longer applicable, but some of them aspects are still applicable and empirically adequate, and that's why we can incorporate them in with Einstein's theory of relativity. Having said that, how would you play with this in terms of what the role of facts are doing here and the potential consequences of paradigm shifts? So someone obviously like Kuhn would say that there are two different paradigms operating here, therefore there are two different theories that are painting two different realities. You've just said why that's not necessarily the case, and many would agree with that. But then how do we treat these facts that are changing from aspects of Newtonian mechanics to Einstein's theory of relativity? Is this an issue? And if so, what does this say about the constitution of facts themselves?
Yeah, those are all excellent questions. Now, I'm assuming we have a couple of hours to go, right? We'll do our best. We'll do our best. Okay, so no, those are very good questions. Now, Kuhn himself was notoriously sort of ambivalent about exactly what he was after, because he's claimed both by the realist and the anti-realist in philosophy of science, which is kind of weird because they're very different positions. And even more so interesting is the fact that Kuhn is actually claimed both by philosophers of science, who tend to be, by and large, pretty sympathetic to science as an epistemic enterprise. I mean, philosophers of science have a lot of respect for science, arguably more so than scientists have for philosophy of science. But Bacon is also claimed by postmodernists.